I mapped my attention for a week. Every time I switched tasks, voluntarily or because something interrupted me, I made a note. By the end of the week, I had a page full of tally marks, and I sat with it longer than I expected to. The number itself was uncomfortable, but that wasn't really what got to me. What got to me was how invisible the switching had been while it was happening. I had genuinely believed I was focused. In the moment, it felt like focus. It had the texture of concentration, the posture, the silence, the sense of being engaged with one thing. What I discovered, looking at the data afterward, was that I'd actually been maintaining a convincing performance of focus, while my attention moved in and out like weather. Drifting, returning, drifting again, without ever announcing itself. And the performance had been good enough to fool me completely, apparently for years. There's something strange about being deceived by your own mind in real time. Not lied to by someone else, deceived by the very faculty you'd use to catch a lie. The first thing I want to sit with is this. Focus is not a personality trait. It's tempting to sort people into focused people and scattered people, as if it were fixed like eye color. But it isn't fixed, it's a skill. And skills behave in predictable ways. They atrophy without practice, and they strengthen with deliberate cultivation. Which means the story I'd been telling myself, some version of, I'm just not a focused person, was never really true. It was a description of a trained habit, not a diagnosis of who I am. That's the more comfortable realization. Here's the less comfortable one. Distraction and the environment most of us live in now is not a personal failure. It is the intended outcome of systems built by some of the most intelligent people on Earth, specifically engineered to capture and hold attention. Every notification, every autoplay, every infinite scroll, these aren't accidents of bad design. They're the product of extraordinary design, aimed with precision at exactly the part of the brain that decides what to look at next, which changes the nature of the problem entirely. If distraction were simply a matter of personal weakness, the solution would be willpower. Try harder, care more. But willpower is a single, exhaustible resource going up against systems that never get tired, never stop iterating, and are optimized by teams of people whose only job is to win that exact contest. That's not a fair fight, and it was never going to be won by trying harder. So, if it isn't a willpower problem, what is it? I think it's an architecture problem, not building more discipline, but building different conditions. The kind of environment in which sustained attention becomes possible again, almost as a byproduct of the space itself rather than a battle fought within it. Architecture doesn't ask you to resist temptation 800 times a day. It just removes the 800 small invitations before they ever reach you. Which raises the actual question underneath all of this. Not how do I focus better, but something closer to what would it mean to treat your own attention as something worth protecting with the same seriousness you'd give any other valuable finite resource. Not managed, not optimized, protected. I keep thinking about how normal it started to feel, checking a phone mid-sentence, mid-conversation, mid-thought, without any conscious decision to do it. The reflex happens faster than the decision does. That's not a small thing. It means the switching has gone below the level of choice entirely, into something closer to instinct. And you can't out-willpower an instinct. You can only change the environment that's training it. I don't have a clean answer yet, but I know the week of tally marks changed how I think about the question. It's one thing to suspect your focus has slipped. It's another to see the exact shape of the slipping, written down in your own handwriting, and realize the gap between what you believed and what was actually happening was never closing on its own. There's a particular kind of humility required to admit that you're not, in fact, choosing most of what you look at. We like to think of attention as something we direct. I look here because I want to. I click this because it interests me. But somewhere behind that feeling of choice sits an enormous amount of design, built by people who study human behavior for a living. whose entire job is to make sure your next glance goes exactly where they intended it to go. It helps to say that plainly, without dramatizing it. This isn't a conspiracy, it's an industry. Thousands of designers, behavioral scientists, and engineers working in teams, running thousands of experiments a year, all converging on the same basic finding, that certain colors, certain sounds, certain intervals of unpredictability will reliably pull a human mind toward a screen and keep it there. None of it is secret. Much of it has been written about openly, in interviews, in patents, in slide decks meant for investors rather than users. What's harder to sit with is the asymmetry. On one side of the screen, a single person trying to get through a day with a finite and depleting amount of mental energy. On the other side, a system with unlimited patience, unlimited iterations, and a direct financial incentive to win. You are not fighting a website. You are fighting the accumulated output of some of the most capable engineering and psychological talent of this era, applied relentlessly to one narrow target, your next few seconds. Once you see it this way, a strange kind of relief becomes available. If you've spent years quietly blaming yourself for a wandering mind, for the compulsive check, for the hour that disappeared into nothing you can quite remember, it's worth asking whether that blame was ever accurate. You are not competing on equal footing. Nobody is. That doesn't mean you're powerless. It means the fight was misidentified. The goal was never to develop a stronger will than the mechanism opposing you, because that mechanism doesn't tire, and you do. The real goal is to reduce how often you enter that fight at all. Every notification silenced, every app removed from the home screen, every default changed is one less contest you have to win through sheer effort. You start winning by refusing to compete on their terms. There's something almost architectural about this idea of capture. These systems weren't dropped into your life by accident. They were built, layer by layer, the way a building is built, with each layer serving a specific function. Get you in, keep you in, bring you back. Once you notice that it has a structure, it stops feeling like fate and starts feeling like something you're allowed to study, take apart, and choose not to live inside. We spend so much time asking what's wrong with our focus. Maybe the more useful question is what exactly was built to interrupt it, and by whom, and for what purpose. Once you can name the structure, you're no longer just a person losing a private battle with your own mind. You're someone who understands the terms of the actual contest being run. We tend to imagine willpower as the deciding factor, the variable that separates people who stay focused from people who don't. But if the environment itself is engineered against sustained attention, willpower was never going to be the deciding factor. It's like judging someone's swimming ability while ignoring that the water is being actively pulled out from under them. You can be strong and still lose if the contest was rigged before you arrived. I think about how differently this reads once you strip away the personal shame for it. It's one thing to think quietly that you're undisciplined. It's another to realize that an entire well-funded, highly competent industry has spent 2 decades refining its ability to outmaneuver exactly the kind of discipline you're blaming yourself for lacking. That doesn't excuse disengagement. It just relocates the responsibility to where it can actually be useful. Not in willing yourself into a stronger person, but in understanding the mechanism well enough to stop feeding it by default. Somewhere in there is the actual shift worth making. Not more resolve, more awareness of what the resolve is up against, and willingness to build differently around it. Somewhere along the way, I started thinking of open tabs as a kind of rent. Not money changing hands, but something quieter. A portion of working memory handed over indefinitely to whatever's sitting there unresolved. The article I meant to finish, the email I haven't answered, the app icon with the small red number I haven't cleared. None of it is loud. None of it demands anything directly. It just sits there, charging a low, continuous fee. You don't notice the fee in any single moment. That's what makes it different from an interruption. An interruption announces itself, a ping, a buzz, a flash of light. This is quieter than that. It's ambient. A dozen small, unresolved things, each taking up almost nothing on its own, adding up to a mind that never quite feels clear without any specific culprit you could point to.
I think this is part of why rest can feel so unsatisfying lately. You close the laptop, put the phone face down, and still feel like something is running in the background. Because something is. The tabs are still open, even if the screen is off. The unanswered messages are still unanswered. The mind keeps a kind of internal tally of everything it hasn't finished, and that tally doesn't pause just because you've stopped looking at it. There's a useful distinction between attention that's actively engaged and attention that's simply obligated. Actively engaged attention feels alive. You're doing the thing, thinking the thought, present in it. Obligated attention is different. It's the sensation of owing something your focus without currently paying it. 16 browser tabs are 16 small IOUs. A phone full of unread notifications is a stack of debts you agreed to, mostly without noticing you'd agreed to anything at all. We rarely audit this the way we'd audit an actual bill. Nobody sits down at the end of the month and asks, how much of my attention did I lend out this week and to what? And did any of it come back with interest? But maybe that's worth doing occasionally. Not as a productivity exercise, but as a kind of honest accounting. What exactly is currently renting space in my head? Is any of it worth the rent it's charging? I've started closing tabs I know I'll never return to, and it produces a small, disproportionate relief every time. Not because the tab mattered, because closing it means one fewer thing quietly borrowing from a limited account. The same goes for notifications, for half-finished conversations left hanging, for the podcast paused at minute 11 that I have no real intention of finishing. Each one left open is a small withdrawal I keep forgetting I'm making. There's something almost freeing in realizing how much of the noise isn't coming from any single overwhelming thing, but from dozens of small unresolved ones, each easy to dismiss individually and expensive collectively. You don't need a dramatic intervention to address it. You need an audit, a willingness to close what isn't being used, finish what can be finished quickly, and let go of what was never going to be finished at all. I used to think clearing my head meant thinking harder about the thing that was bothering me, sitting with it until it resolved itself. Sometimes that's true. But just as often, what actually helped was smaller and less dramatic than that. Closing the tab, muting the thread, deleting the app I kept opening out of habit rather than interest. Not resolving the thing, just stopping the quiet rent it was charging. It makes me wonder how much of what we call mental clutter isn't clutter in the way we usually picture it. Chaotic, loud, obviously overwhelming, but something closer to a long list of small, forgotten subscriptions, each one still being paid, none of them canceled because none of them ever announced that they were still running.
There's a concept researchers call attention residue. And once you learn the term, it becomes hard to stop noticing it in your own life. The idea is simple. When you switch from one task to another, part of your mind doesn't fully make the switch with you. A fragment of it stays behind, still working on the thing you just left, even as you sit down to start something new. You feel this most clearly in the quality of the work that follows. You finish a tense email, open a document, and the first few paragraphs come out a little flatter than they should. Not because the new task is harder, because part of your attention is still back in the inbox, replaying a sentence you're not sure you phrased correctly. The switch happened on the calendar. It didn't happen in the mind. We tend to measure the cost of switching tasks by the interruption itself, the few seconds it takes to close one window and open another. That's the visible cost, and it's almost nothing. The real cost is invisible and much larger. It's the 10 or 15 minutes afterward where you're only partially present in the new task, still running background processes related to the old one, producing work that's technically finished but quietly diminished. I started paying attention to how often I switch in an average hour, and the number embarrassed me. Not because switching is inherently bad. Some tasks genuinely benefit from being interrupted, revisited later with fresh eyes. But most of my switching wasn't strategic, it was reflexive. A message arrives, I answer it immediately, then spend the next several minutes reassembling whatever thread of thought I was following before the message showed up.
The reassembly is the expensive part, and it's almost entirely hidden from view. There's an old idea, mostly abandoned now, that the human mind can multitask the way a computer processes several programs at once. It can't. What actually happens is a rapid, exhausting alternation, attention moving back and forth, paying a small cognitive toll every time it crosses from one task to the other. Do this often enough across a day, and the toll adds up to something significant, even though no single instance of it feels significant on its own. What strikes me is how little this shows up in how we talk about productivity. We measure hours worked, tasks completed, messages answered. We rarely measure how fragmented those hours actually were, or how much of the output was produced at partial capacity, because some other unfinished task was still quietly running underneath it. A day can look full and still have been mostly residue. I've started trying something small. Before switching tasks, taking a few seconds to actually close the previous one out, even just mentally, naming where I left off, what the next step will be, so the mind doesn't have to keep an open thread running in the background just to remember. It doesn't eliminate the cost of switching, but it seems to shorten the tail of it, the part that follows you into whatever comes next. You can see the same pattern in conversations, not just tasks. Someone finishes telling you something, and you realize a moment later that you were only half listening, still composing a reply to a different message in your head. The words registered. The presence did it. It's the same mechanism, just wearing a different outfit. Attention that looks focused from the outside, while actually running two threads at once, neither of them getting full resources. I don't think the answer is doing fewer things. Some days genuinely require handling many small tasks in quick succession, and that's just the shape of the work. The more useful shift might be smaller than that. Noticing when a switch is happening and giving the mind even a few seconds to actually complete the handoff, instead of dragging the last task along, unfinished, into whatever comes next. Maybe the honest question isn't how many things you got done today, but how many of them you were actually present for while you're doing them.
If distraction is architecture built deliberately to capture attention, then the answer to it probably has to be architecture too. Not a better morning routine, not another productivity technique layered on top of the same environment that keeps defeating it. An actual room, physical or digital, built with a different intention from the start. I started with the physical version because it felt more within reach. What would a space look like if its entire purpose was to make sustained attention easier rather than harder? Fewer visible surfaces competing for the eye. Nothing charging within arm's reach. A single task's materials out and nothing else out. It sounds almost too simple to matter, but the mind responds to a room the way it responds to a conversation. It will engage with whatever is presented to it, and a room full of competing objects is a room full of competing invitations. The digital version is harder because it doesn't have walls, but it can still have edges. A device with one app open instead of 12. A browser with the interesting but irrelevant tabs closed rather than minimized, because minimized still counts as present, still costs a small tax just by existing in the periphery. Notifications turned off entirely, not silenced, because silence still shows the message waiting to be read the moment you glance down. What I've noticed is that architecture works precisely because it doesn't rely on you noticing it working. A room engineered for distraction doesn't need your permission to distract you. It just does, continuously, by design. A room engineered for depth operates the same way in reverse. You don't have to resist anything if the thing worth resisting was never placed in front of you to begin with. The fight gets removed before it starts, rather than won after it begins. There's a temptation to think of this as deprivation, as though a stripped down room or a single tab browser is somehow a smaller life than the one filled with options. I don't experience it that way. It feels more like the opposite. Like most of what gets removed wasn't actually adding anything, just competing for space that could otherwise go toward one thing done well. A cluttered room isn't a room with more possibility in it. It's a room with more noise in it.
We tend to think of self-control as an internal muscle, something you build through repeated effort, like training for a marathon. But a room built with intention does something more efficient than training willpower. It removes the need for as much of it. You don't have to out-discipline 100 small temptations if 90 of them were never in the room. I keep coming back to a simple test now whenever I sit down to actually focus. Does this space help me or does it just tolerate me? Most spaces, as they exist by default, tolerate focus. They don't actively support it. And the difference between those two things, it turns out, is almost the entire difference between a productive hour and a scattered one. None of this requires a dramatic overhaul. You don't need to buy new furniture or a move to a cabin somewhere remote. Most of it is subtraction rather than addition. Closing what doesn't need to be open, putting away what doesn't need to be visible, turning off what doesn't need to be on. The room gets quieter, and something in the mind quiets down along with it, almost involuntarily, the way a room full of people naturally lowers its voice when the lights dim. What surprised me most was how quickly the mind adapts to a well-built space. It doesn't take weeks of discipline to feel the difference. It takes an afternoon in a room that isn't competing with you. And the contrast against every other room you've worked in becomes almost impossible to ignore afterward.
There's a version of multitasking that feels good while you're doing it. Emails open in one window, a podcast running in the background, a document half written in another tab, phone within reach for anything urgent. In the moment, it feels like momentum, like you're moving on several fronts at once, covering more ground than a single narrow task ever could. I want to be honest about that feeling, because I think it's the actual reason multitasking survives as a habit despite decades of research telling us it doesn't work the way we think it does. It's not that people don't know the research exists, it's that the research describes an outcome, and the outcome isn't what keeps you doing it. The feeling is what keeps you doing it. And the feeling of doing several things is genuinely more stimulating than the feeling of doing one thing slowly and well. But stimulation and effectiveness are different currencies, and it's easy to spend one while believing you're earning the other. A day spent multitasking can feel unusually productive by the end of it. The mind stayed busy, activated, engaged with something at every moment, while producing measurably less than a day spent moving through the same tasks one at a time. The busyness is real, the output attached to it is smaller than the busyness implies. What actually happens during multitasking isn't parallel processing, it's rapid serial processing. Attention hopping between tasks quickly enough to create the illusion of simultaneity. Each hop carries a cost, a brief reorientation the brain has to perform every time it re-engages with the task it just left. Do this often enough within an hour, and a meaningful percentage of that hour gets spent not on any task, but on the transition between tasks. Work that produces nothing visible to no one, including yourself. I think part of what makes this myth so durable is that we've built an entire cultural vocabulary around it that treats busyness as a form of virtue. Someone juggling 5 things at once looks more impressive, more in demand, more capable than someone doing one thing with total attention. We reward the appearance of multitasking even when we suspect, privately, that the person doing one thing carefully is probably producing better work. The performance of busyness has its own social payoff, separate from whether it actually produces anything. There's an experiment worth trying, if only once. Take a task you'd normally do while doing 3 other things, and do it alone instead. Nothing else open, nothing else running. Notice how much faster it finishes. Notice how much less effort it seems to require, even though nothing about the task itself changed. What changed was the absence of the constant reorientation tax that multitasking quietly charges without ever presenting the bill. I don't think the goal has to be doing everything one thing at a time forever. Some tasks genuinely tolerate being layered. A walk and a phone call, folding laundry and a podcast. The distinction seems to be whether both tasks require attention, or only one of them does. The myth isn't that multitasking is always wrong. The myth is that it's free. We rarely ask what multitasking is actually protecting us from. Sometimes I think the appeal isn't the tasks themselves, but the discomfort of sitting with just one thing long enough to feel how hard it actually is. Layering three tasks together lets you escape any single one of them the moment it gets difficult, hopping to something easier before the difficulty has to be faced directly. Multitasking, looked at that way, isn't only an efficiency question, it's sometimes an avoidance strategy wearing efficiency's clothes. That reframing changed something for me. The question stopped being purely about output and became more about what I was actually running from every time I reached for a second task before finishing the first.
We already use the language of money to talk about attention, and I don't think it's an accident. You pay attention. You spend an afternoon on something. Something costs you your focus. The vocabulary got there before the concept did, which usually means the metaphor is doing more work than we give it credit for. Money and attention share a strange property. Both are finite, both replenish over time, and both can be spent well or spent carelessly without you necessarily noticing the difference in the moment. But we treat them very differently. Most people can tell you approximately what they earn and roughly where it goes each month. Almost nobody can tell you where their attention went yesterday in anything like that same detail. We've built elaborate systems for tracking one resource and left the other almost entirely unaudited, despite the fact that attention is arguably the more foundational of the two. It's the thing that determines how well the money gets earned in the first place. I tried for a few days, treating my attention the way I'd treat a modest daily budget. Not unlimited, not something to spend reflexively on whatever asked for it loudest. A fixed amount allocated deliberately with the same seriousness I'd bring to an actual expense. The exercise felt strange at first, almost bureaucratic, applying financial language to something that had always felt more like weather than currency. But the strangeness faded quickly, replaced by something closer to clarity. What became obvious almost immediately was how much of my daily attention was being spent on things that would never have survived an actual budget review. 5 minutes here on a headline that changed nothing about my day. 10 minutes there on a notification that required no real response. None of it dramatic on its own. All of it together, a meaningful fraction of a finite daily allowance spent on line items that wouldn't have made it past the first pass of scrutiny if I were looking at a bank statement instead of a mental one. There's a concept in economics called opportunity cost. The idea that spending resources on one thing means those same resources can't be spent on something else, even if the something else was never explicitly considered. Attention works exactly the same way, except the opportunity cost is almost never visible. You don't see the deep work you didn't do because you spent the morning on shallow tasks. You just experience a vague sense by evening that the day didn't add up to much, without a clear culprit to point to. Treating attention as currency doesn't mean rationing it anxiously or turning every hour into a spreadsheet. It means asking occasionally, and honestly, whether what you're about to give your focus to is actually worth what it costs. Not morally worth it, just worth it, the way you'd weigh any purchase against a limited budget. Is this the best use of a resource I only get a fixed amount of today and won't get back once it's spent? I'd started thinking of the best hours of a day the way I think of the best dollars, the ones spent early, before fatigue and distraction erode their value, invested in whatever actually matters most rather than whatever showed up first and asked loudest. You can extend the metaphor further than it might first seem to deserve. Interest exists in both systems too. Attention invested consistently in one direction compounds. A skill sharpens. A relationship deepens. A piece of work gets genuinely good, not through any single burst of focus, but through repeated, deliberate deposits over time. Attention scattered across dozens of shallow directions rarely compounds into anything. It just gets spent once and disappears, the way loose change disappears without ever becoming savings. Maybe that's the real argument for taking this metaphor seriously instead of treating it as a cute turn of phrase.
Money mismanaged quietly erodes a future you can't quite picture yet. Attention mismanaged does the same thing, just slower and far less visibly, until one day you look back at a year and can't fully account for where the best of it went.
There's a moment, maybe 20 minutes into real focus, when something shifts that's hard to describe accurately unless you've felt it recently. The static quiets, the low hum of half-formed thoughts, the mental equivalent of background noise just stops. You're not fighting to stay on task anymore. You're inside it in a way that doesn't require effort to maintain, only effort to have arrived at in the first place. I'd almost forgotten what that felt like before I started paying attention to my attention. Not because I'd never experienced it, I clearly had, at some earlier point, or I wouldn't recognize it now. But it had become rare enough that when it happened again, after a stretch of fragmented weeks, it registered almost as a physical sensation. A kind of settling, shoulders that had been slightly raised without my noticing dropping, a breath that went a little deeper than the last several hundred had gone. What surprised me most wasn't the return of focus itself, it was how quickly I remembered what I'd been missing. There's a version of fragmented attention that becomes normal enough to stop registering as a loss. You adapt to static the way you adapt to a hum in a room until you can't hear it anymore, not because it stopped, but because your ears gave up flagging it. The return doesn't just bring focus back, it makes the absence of it in retrospect suddenly audible again. I think this is part of why the return matters so much, beyond whatever gets produced during it. It's evidence, proof in a felt and immediate way that the capacity never actually left, it was buried under noise, not replaced by something incompatible with it. That distinction matters more than it might seem to. Buried means recoverable. Replaced would mean something closer to loss, a door that's actually closed rather than one that's simply been covered by clutter. The path back rarely announced itself the way the drift away does. Drift is loud in its way. A dozen visible interruptions, a dozen identifiable moments where attention clearly left. The return is quieter. It tends to arrive after some threshold of sustained, uninterrupted time has passed, somewhere past the initial restlessness, past the itch to check something, into a stretch where the itch has finally gone quiet on its own. You rarely notice the exact moment it happens, you only notice afterward that it did. There's something worth trusting in that pattern. The itch to check, to switch, to interrupt yourself. It isn't permanent. It has a shape, a rise, and eventually a fall if you give it enough uninterrupted time to complete its own arc instead of feeding it every time it flares. Most people never let it complete because the moment it flares feels unbearable enough to reach for relief immediately. But the discomfort of staying past that flare is where the return tends to live, just on the other side of it. I don't think chasing that state constantly is realistic or even necessary. Some tasks don't require it, but knowing it's still there, still reachable, changes how you relate to the fragmented stretches in between. They stop feeling like the permanent condition and start feeling like the weather in front of a climate that's actually still intact underneath. I've started noticing small signals that the return is close before it actually arrives, a slight impatience with my own restlessness, almost a fatigue with the switching itself, as if some part of the mind gets tired of running the same loop and starts looking, on its own, for something steadier to hold on to. That signal used to feel like a warning that I was losing focus entirely. Now I read it more like the last flicker before a room settles down, the moment right before the static finally drops out. It makes me wonder how much of what we call losing focus is really just the middle of a longer process that hasn't finished yet, one that gets abandoned constantly right before the part that actually resolves it. I started this by mapping a week of my own attention and being unsettled by what I found. Not the number exactly, but the invisibility of it. The sense that I had been performing focus convincingly enough to fool myself while something else entirely was happening underneath. Everything since has been an attempt to understand that gap between the performance and the reality, and what it would actually take to close it.
What became clear along the way is that none of this was ever really about willpower. The systems built to capture attention are the product of extraordinary design, engineered by people who understand human psychology better than most of us understand ourselves. And no amount of personal discipline was ever going to outcompete that on its own terms. The fight had to be relocated somewhere more useful, into architecture, into the structure of a room or a device or a day, built deliberately enough that the fight barely needs to happen at all. Along the way, a few smaller truths kept surfacing, each one a piece of the same larger picture. Attention doesn't only get taken in dramatic interruptions. Just as often, it gets quietly borrowed. An open tab, an unanswered message, a small unresolved thing sitting in the background, charging rent without ever announcing itself. Every switch between tasks leaves something behind, a residue that follows you into whatever comes next, making the next 20 minutes a little less present than they could have been. And multitasking, for all its appeal, was never actually free. It just hit its cost well enough that the bill rarely arrived when the spending happened. Treating attention like a currency changed something in how I related to all of it. Not by turning every hour into a ledger, but by asking, more honestly than I used to, whether what I was about to spend my focus on was actually worth what it cost. And underneath all of that sat something I hadn't expected to find, that the capacity for sustained focus was never actually gone. It was buried, not replaced, recoverable, not lost. The return, when it came, was quiet, and it usually only arrived after I let the restlessness run its course instead of feeding it the moment it flared. Looking back across all of it, I keep landing on the same image from the very beginning. A page of tally marks, more of them than I expected, each one a small moment where my attention moved without my noticing. I don't think that page was ever really about the number. I think it was about the fact that something so central to how I experience my own life had become so unexamined. We audit our finances, we track our health. Almost nobody tracks the thing that determines how present they are for any of it. There's a version of this series that could have stayed purely conceptual, attention as an abstract thing to think about rather than a lived experience to notice. But the most useful moments for me weren't the ideas themselves. They were the small practical shifts that came out of them. Closing a tab I know I'd never return to, sitting in a stripped down room and feeling the difference within an hour, catching the itch to switch tasks and letting it pass instead of obeying it automatically. None of it dramatic, all of it together adding up to a slowly rebuild trust in my own capacity to stay with something. None of this resolves into a tidy formula, and I don't think it should. Some days will still be scattered. Some rooms won't be built the way they should be. The systems designed to pull attention away aren't going anywhere, and they'll keep getting better at their job faster than most of us get better at resisting them. What changes, maybe, is the relationship to all of it. Less shame about the drift, more curiosity about the architecture behind it, and an occasional willingness to build a little differently around the parts that matter most. So here's why I actually want to leave this. The same question underneath everything I've been circling for 9 segments now. If you mapped your own attention for a week, honestly, without judging what you found, what do you think it would show you? And would you have the courage to build differently around it once you saw it?